And we continue our coverage of the race for governor in North Carolina. So for much more, we want to bring in Mike Ross, who is a candidate for governor, the Libertarian candidate there in North Carolina. So Mr. Ross, thank you so much for joining us. I think ultimately, a lot of people here, Libertarian, third party, tough sledding for some third parties. So I think ultimately, why run for governor in North Carolina?
Yeah, absolutely. First off, thanks so much for having me on the show. And I really think it comes down to the people of North Carolina deserve some representation. The largest block of voters in this state is unaffiliated. There's more of them than Republicans and Democrats, but the entire Council of State, our state Supreme Court, and our entire legislature is just made up of Republicans and Democrats. And far too often, I see them basically just going along with whatever the Republicans and Democrats in D.C. want. So I'm looking to bring libertarian principles focused on things that I think matter to regular North Carolinians, where the only special interest group that I actually care to cater to is the people of North Carolina. And I think we're seeing more and more third parties getting more and more attention due to what I would say is kind of disdain for the uniparty at this point.
Yeah, and I think that's also brings up a lot of curiosity for me. I mean, North Carolina is a very interesting state because you have a Democratic governor, you've got a supermajority of Republicans. So where's the avenue for libertarians that you see moving forward in your state?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I think about libertarians, our philosophy is something that I think most North Carolinians would agree with, and many of them don't even know what a libertarian is. But I know that we're seeing things hitting regular people, right? Rent, prices on everything going up. We've got one side screaming that the economy is great, but it sure doesn't feel that way for most North Carolinians. And I think getting back to basics with some foundational liberty-based principles is something that North Carolinians will really go for, right? I think they're tired of the division, and I think things we're seeing geopolitically across the world, right? There's now a libertarian head of state for the first time ever in Argentina. And I think that that's going to be an opportunity for people to pay a little bit more attention. And I think that common sense, libertarian, free market solutions would be beneficial for the people of North Carolina. And I just have to get that message out to them.
You mentioned free market. Brings me to my very next question already. Set up perfectly there. On your website, you are for free market education. What exactly do you mean by that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we look at the current situation here in North Carolina, and our state constitution requires that we provide an education. And I think that that's important, right? Education is how we make sure our greatest resource, our children, is prepared for the next, prepared for the future. But at the end of the day, we have a situation where the government is controlling that entire process from curriculum all the way down to funding. So when I think free market education, I think that breaking the monopoly that the government has on education is going to be a good thing. Right? At the end of the day, when we look at free market principles, competition benefits the consumers. And the consumers of education in this case are the students. So I believe that those dollars should follow the student. Not in the way the Republicans are doing it with this school choice, which I just think is going to lead to the ideological takeover of private education, but truly letting the parents be the decision makers there and forcing the public schools ultimately to compete. Because if they're forced to compete, one of two things will happen. They'll either get better and succeed in competition, or those monies would ultimately flow to solutions that are providing better educations. Because I look at the current system, and there's so much bloat in the budget. We're talking about how underpaid teachers are. We spend about $13,000 per student in this state. And that means that if a teacher had 10 students in the classroom, if that money was flowing to that teacher like a business, that'd be paying teachers $130,000 if they were operating as a business. And sadly, our teachers are not making anywhere near what I think that they would in a free market. And instead, you're just seeing bloated lines of administration, lots of distributing it out to people who are in connection and the lobbying. And I think if you force them to compete, at least the evidence that I see in pretty much anywhere I look is that if you force that competition, quality is going to get better and price is going to come down. And that ultimately means better education and more prepared North Carolina students.
You say you don't want that same model that Republicans are pushing, but what you're saying sounds a lot like what Republicans say, driving the competition. They think competition is good for education. So what's the main difference between your strategy and the Republican strategy when it comes to private schools and charter schools?
Yeah. So when you look at what the education, the Republicans are doing, right, is that they're basically setting up a voucher system to go to existing private schools, religious schools, things like that, trying to open it up to have them compete with the dollars. But when you look at the nuance of what they're doing there, they're essentially saying, if you want to play along here, you have to follow all these rules and regulations. And what that means is any time that you turn on, turn on the faucet of government money coming into these schools, you're going to make these schools dependent on that. I think my plan is more in line with my campaign team has said another comparison is what you would call backpack funding, right? Where you're not limiting it just to these private schools, right? If you want to give your child an education through the use of, just private tutors or micro schools or community schools or anything that the free market may come up with, those dollars ultimately I want to see being spent by the parents, where those dollars truly follow the student and are not there as a way to ideologically capture the private institutions. I want the government away from the spending decisions. I want them away from the curriculum decisions. I want it to be a relationship that truly works in the interest of the students, where the people making the decisions are the students, the parents, and the teachers, no one from the government.
Now, wouldn't there be some concern in regards to public education? Is because if parents decide that they want to take education elsewhere, then it leaves public education maybe in a bind, when a lot of kids are left out in the cold because they weren't able to find a place to go to school.
Sure. Well, from that standpoint, I don't think if you're truly freeing the market and breaking the monopoly, that becomes an issue, because I'm not asking for the public schools to go anywhere, right? At the end of the day, if the public schools are failing, the ideas of just throwing endless money on a failing system is not good for the taxpayer. At the end of the day, we want our children to get a good education so that they can go out and compete in the real world and live as successful adults. And what I think, when you look at the public school system, you see this massive growth in things like administration, principals, all these jobs, and that money is not actually going to the people who are producing the education, the teachers. So what I think would happen is it would put some pressure on the public school system, and I think that would force the public school system to compete. But giving them a blank check and continuing to drive up our taxes as hardworking North Carolinians, I just don't think is in the interest of anybody other than the special interests within the education lobby, the teachers' unions, because it's really not rewarding the teachers. You look at teacher pay, it's not keeping up. And if any other industry where you have competition, the producers are actually getting a larger share of the value. And I think that the teachers are actually one of the biggest victims of this whole system.
Something that libertarians are pretty widely known for is legalizing drugs. You write on your website that you don't feel that the government has a right to tell you what you can and cannot ingest in your body. So where do you stand on legalizing drugs? Do you want to legalize all drugs?
Yeah, so I mean that comes across, and I say this, a lot of people are going to call me a radical candidate, but I look at things primarily through a free market economic lens. And I think that the status quo is actually far more radical, right? When we look at North Carolina, one of the biggest things when it comes to the war on drugs that we're dealing with is the fentanyl problem, right? I think we can all agree. I think it's, people are dying left and right across the strait from fentanyl. And the reality is that's not necessarily just a drug problem. In many cases, it's a fraud problem. What you're seeing people that are out there seeking something, usually pharmaceuticals, and then they're being essentially fraudulently poisoned by putting fentanyl in. And again, this all comes down to competition. The war on drugs is essentially criminalizing actions and forcing us as taxpayers to pay for the enforcement of that. When I think if you truly want to get rid of the fentanyl problem, force the cartels and the drug dealers to compete with tax-paying, law-abiding businesses, right? So if that person who's addicted to drugs, what they really need is they need treatment. They need therapy. They need an opportunity to get their dignity and confidence back to go compete in the world again. And I think that throwing them in a cage with violent criminals and forcing us to pay, about $100,000 a year to keep them there is not a good use of our money. Where if you end the war on drugs and you use that process to fund things like treatment, substance abuse treatment, the fentanyl problem as far as overdosing is going to go away, because places like CVS and Walgreens are not going to put fentanyl in if they're telling you they're selling you oxycodone or something like that. So I do think on both a moral level and an economic level, the war on drugs has been a huge failure for the United States. And if we could shift those resources into actually treating people and helping people break that, I think that we'll get better outcomes and ultimately save the taxpayers a lot of money.
Fentanyl is a huge problem, really across America. And so just for clarification and make sure we have it, because we want to make sure that voters are informed here, legalizing all drugs, you want to do that?
I think, I don't know if the appetite for the public is there yet. I think that we can make the case, right? I think from the first hand, President Biden has said he would deschedule cannabis. I think that right now we're costing North Carolina farmers a lot through our restrictions. I think that we can start there and then make the case and really look at the data there and ask yourself, do we want North Carolina taxpayers to essentially put people who are suffering from addiction in a cage and pay to uphold that? Or should we think of more compassionate solutions that can actually help get them contributing to the economy and to society and get them clean? Because I don't think that the data suggests that putting them in a cage is actually going to create meaningful change. We're putting addicts in cages where they're around violent criminals and they're coming out with a higher degree of criminality than they went in with. And to me, that's ultimately driving problems with safety, and other issues in our society. So I do think ideologically that, ending the war on drugs completely and forcing those criminal cartels to compete with law-abiding businesses would make it harder for them. And ultimately, if we're smart with how we reallocate those resources, I think we could actually make a dent in the addiction problem that we're seeing throughout the state and throughout the country, really.
I think lastly here, what would a Mike Ross administration look like? Why do you want people to vote for you, especially in this primary?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the biggest thing that I would offer as a libertarian is one, what it would mean for a libertarian to actually win the race. To me, that comes across as a mandate that the people of North Carolina, if they come out and vote in droves for a third-party candidate and we win, I think that's a mandate to actually act on my platform, right? To bring common sense, free market economics to all of these principles. And I'd like to say that I'd be the biggest thorn in the side of DC that any governor has ever been, right? I think that we need to really look at this role and get back to our roots as a constitutional republic, where when the federal government is overreaching, it really relies on the state governments to protect us from that. And I would be a thorn in the side of the federal government, and I would govern for the people of North Carolina with common sense free market policy.
All right, Mike Ross, candidate for North Carolina governor. Mr. Ross, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.